Welcome to the Darkstream. Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and the author of Jordanetics, the journey into the mind of humanity's greatest thinker. So today, I thought it would be useful to address some of the complaints that we've been getting from Jordan Peterson fans. Some criticisms that we've been getting from Jordan Peterson fans relating to this book. And what I think is really interesting is that the most common complaint that we hear is that I am not providing any detail. I'm not substantiating my criticism in these videos. And they're saying, you're just saying stuff. You're just making accusations and so forth. And that's not really true. That's not true at all, in fact. And so let's talk about Jordanetics. Let's get into the detail, and let's go ahead and look at each of these 12 rules in detail, one at a time. And I'm not going to cover absolutely everything that I talk about in the book, but I am going to address all of the substantial and relevant details from the chapters. So, without further ado, what's the first rule? Stand up straight with your shoulders back. All right? Now, the interesting thing is that, and something that I note, is that whenever you talk to an expert about something that Jordan Peterson addresses, that expert invariably says that Jordan Peterson is wrong. And that's why in this chapter I begin with a quote from my old enemy, Dr. P.Z. Myers, who says, "He's built a case on false facts and distortions of general observations from the scientific literature. He has not demonstrated anything about social cultural constructions. Not only does he get the evidence wrong, he can't construct any kind of logical argument. It's appalling to the degree to which this man is asserting nonsense with such smug confidence. This man is lying to you, and if you fall for any of it, you should be embarrassed." And the thing is, if you know anything about my long and very negative history with P.Z. Myers, the mere fact that both of us, the hardcore atheist P.Z. Myers and the evangelical Christian Voxday, completely agree that Jordan Peterson is a charlatan and that you should be embarrassed about if you believe anything he says, that at least should give you some idea that maybe something is off with this guy. Now, here's the thing that I noticed first when I started reading the 12 rules. That is, Peterson never talks about the actual rule. In one chapter, it's so bad that the entire chapter is not about anything that has to do with the rule. Now, at least in this first chapter, there is some relationship between the rule, stand up straight with your shoulders back, and this whole digression into lobsters. Now, what's interesting is that he tries to use lobsters both as a metaphor for his dominance hierarchy, as well as an implicit argument that dominance hierarchies are structurally built into us. And so some people have complained about my some of the ways that P.Z. Myers and the other biologists completely mock Peterson, because lobsters are from a different branch, a different evolutionary branch. If you buy into evolutionary theory, which obviously Peterson does, the idea that we are somehow inheritors of this crustacean dominance hierarchy, the fact that the idea that we have any relationship to that is intrinsically based upon the idea that there's a relationship between the lobsters and humans. It's not just a metaphor. There's no reason for him to go into the evolutionary theory to rely at all upon evolutionary psychology if he's just using it as a metaphor. He's not just using the metaphor. He's trying to say, he's very, very strongly implying that there is a relationship between the lobster dominance hierarchy and the human one. What he's trying to imply, what he's trying to say is that our dominance hierarchies are natural to us. And that may be the case, but it doesn't change the fact that there's virtually no relationship whatsoever between lobsters and people. There's so much difference even from the evolutionary perspective. In fact, Meyer's criticism is actually too generous, because he was corrected by one of his colleagues who pointed out that there was actually the divergence between the arthropods and the chordates was about 850 million years. So it's as pointless. Talking about lobsters, other than as a pure metaphor, is totally pointless. So why does Peterson get involved? Why does he bring in this science that he clearly doesn't understand? Because he's trying to put a veneer of science over his message. And this is very common among charlatans. Deepak Chopra does it. The higher the regard for science, the more these charlatans attempt to put a scientific veneer over their metaphors and their message. But the interesting thing about his message, first it's very clear that Peterson's books are focused on losers. There's literally nothing here for a normal, successful person. And this is part of the reason why his cult is so fervent and why his fans react so angrily to the criticism of him. What he's addressing the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. This rule is only applicable for people who are at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. If you're a low status 10, you have nowhere to live or nowhere good. Your food is terrible when you're not going hungry. You're in poor physical and mental condition. Those are the people that Peterson is preying on. He is preying on the mentally weak. You're of minimal romantic interest to anyone unless they're as desperate as you. You're more likely to fall ill, age rapidly, and die young. Now keep in mind, these are his rules for life. And this rule is specifically addressed to the person who is on the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, the low status lobster, the 10 out of 10. And of course, being Peterson, he has to invert the usual order. And so he's talking about, he goes in and talks about being bullied. But here's what's interesting. He tries to claim that if you just stand up to the bully, then that will limit their ability to bully you. Now, how many gammas and omegas, how many people of very low status can do anything about the bullying? They can't. He says, if you say no early in the cycle of oppression and you mean what you say, then the scope for oppression on the part of the oppressor will remain properly bounded and limited. Now keep in mind, this is a man who was totally unable on multiple occasions to prevent other little children from bullying his own children. Okay? He has no idea what he's talking about. And so then what he does is he defines two different and ultimately three different orders, or I should say three different realms within the dominance hierarchy. So what he says is the bottom of the dominance hierarchy is chaos. That's the realm of oppression. And again, these are all the people he's talking to. These are the people that feel oppressed, that are bullied, that need to be told to stand up straight. So they are in the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. It's the domain of the oppressed. It's chaos. Now remember, his book, he promises to give you an antidote to chaos. So what is the alternative? Well, the top of the dominance hierarchy is order. So the logical mind thinks that if the antidote to chaos is order, right? Wrong. See, order is the domain of tyrants. And the further up the dominance hierarchy you go, the more tempted you are to bully others. The more tyrannical you will become. And so what he tells you to do is to stand up straight, stand up to your bullies, but don't rise too far. He says that what you need to do is cast dead, rigical, and too tyrannical order back into the chaos in which it was generated. It means withstanding the ensuing uncertainty and establishing, in consequence, a better, more meaningful, and more productive order. So what he's telling you is rise up the dominance hierarchy, but not too far. Don't pursue excellence. Don't try to become the best you that you can possibly be. Because if you do that, then you're going to become a tyrant. Now, the funny thing is, he never, even though he names the realm of dominance, even though he names the domain of tyrants, order, and the domain of oppression, chaos, he never actually names the middle way. So we had to name it for him. I named it the domain of balance. The way he actually describes it is the more perfect order. So you have chaos on the bottom, order on the top, and then in the middle, the more perfect order. So what this comes down to, what he's essentially done, is he has recreated the revised Jedi religion. He is teaching people that that one of the first rule for life is to try to bring balance to the Force. I mean, this is one of the dumbest, most ridiculous pieces of philosophy I have ever seen. Now, there's absolutely no, the other thing, he keeps leaning on evolutionary psychology. Whenever he goes into an extensive illustration, it is usually something related to evolutionary psychology. And so something that I point out from an anthropologist who, in his book, Do We Need God to Be Good? And again, in his more recent book, Ship of Fools, absolutely destroys evolutionary psychology. And this is an anthropologist who actually studies the stuff, lives with these tribes, observes these hunter-gatherer tribes, and notes that all of the theories that the evolutionary psychologists come up with are wrong. And so we talk about that a little bit. And then what Peterson assumes with regards to his first rule is, number one, you're an animal. Number two, if you're a reader of his book, then you're at the bottom of your social hierarchy. You want to rise out of your domain of oppression, and Peterson wants to help you, but only so far. Because as you improve your posture, as you stand up and reject the oppression of others, you need to be careful to avoid rising too far so that you don't turn into a tyrant. And so the first rule does recognize the existence of human social hierarchies. That's useful. There's nothing wrong. It's good to stand up straight with your shoulders back. Good posture is important, and there is a fair amount of nonverbal communication that does have a significant effect on people. It was very interesting one time. my friend was monitoring the Twitter feed at a conference, and I was involved in the conference. At a certain point, I had to go up and give a brief talk. And he was laughing afterwards, and he said, "Wow, you're just naturally good at upsetting people." I was watching the Twitter feed, and somebody had said, "Wow, this guy's really arrogant," and I said, "Well, that's hardly new. What's the, why was that funny?" He said, "Well, you hadn't even opened your mouth yet. You hadn't said anything at all. Just and I saw a picture later which explained it. I was just standing there waiting to be called upon, but I was standing with my hands behind my back and my shoulders, or my feet spread about shoulder width apart. And when you saw the picture, your eye happened to be drawn to the way that I was standing, because I was standing in a fairly confident position, whereas the other people were either sitting down or kind of slouching and stuff. And it did look rather arrogant, even though I wasn't saying anything. I hadn't said a single word. And so there is something to the fact that the way you carry yourself, the way you stand, does communicate your position in the social hierarchy. But that's not the point of the chapter. Posture has nothing to do with bullying. It has nothing to do with the realm of oppression or the realm of tyranny. And so what the first principle, the first real principle of Jordanetics is be mediocre. You don't want to stay at the bottom, but you also don't want to rise too far. And so the purpose of Jordanetics, one of the purposes of Jordanetics, is to explain to people who either haven't read the books, or as is, which you'd be shocked at how many Jordan Peterson fans have never actually read his book. They might own it, but they don't read it because, frankly, it's not very well written. But the first rule, the real first rule of Jordanetics, is be mediocre. And I do not believe that that is a good rule for life. I think that that is a very negative rule for life, and it's not helpful. Now, I do think there is something to be said, because gammas are very much delusional. It's not a bad thing to teach them to be realistic about their goals. If you're familiar with my socio-sexual hierarchy, you're not going to go from gamma to alpha. It's not going to happen. Your patterns of behavior are all wrong. But, and also there's nothing wrong. It's actually really good to go from gamma to delta. You'll be much happier. But that doesn't mean that you should shoot for mediocrity. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to be as excellent and to perform as well as you can. And yet, that's what this whole first chapter is about. The whole first chapter is about becoming mediocre. Now, why? Well, it seems pretty obvious to me, because if you look at everything that Peterson teaches, you shouldn't be proud of your nation. You shouldn't be proud of your team. You shouldn't be proud of your heritage. You should just be a mediocre individual looking to invent meaning in your own life, in your own head. Now, we'll get more into this as we get into the rest of the 12 rules. I'm not going to necessarily do all 12 right in a row, but we will hit all 12 rules. But this should demonstrate very clearly to even the most skeptical Jordan Peterson fan that Jordanetics directly addresses the very arguments and philosophy that Jordan Peterson advocates in his writing and in his books. Everything that I've said is directly quoted from his writings. I invented nothing. In fact, I barely even needed to interpret anything because what he says is very clear. And the true meaning of rule number 1 is be mediocre. And that's why I titled the chapter The Lobster of Mediocrity. So, I've got about 10 more minutes, so if you have any questions, go ahead and fire away. Also, I should mention, Jordanetics is now out in paperback. You can already buy it from Castelia Books Direct. If you want to know how to get there, you can find the link on my blog. Also, we have a new release that I should mention just because we just released it today. Archaven Comics just released the complete omnibus collection of Right Ho Jeeves. It's the most beautiful book we've produced yet. So I think it's 152 pages. Chuck Dixon adapting P.G. Wodehouse. So it's really well written. It's really funny. Gary's art is fantastic. It'd make a fantastic Christmas gift, especially if you want to cheer up your Jordan Peterson fan after he reads Jordanetics. Do you drink any beers or just wine? I drink beer with my soccer team after games, but I mostly drink wine. The people in that round table you linked on the blog sounded more like they had skimmed than actually read your book. Oh, I have no doubt. I'm not even sure that some of them had read Jordan Peterson's books. I mean, they're fans of his, but like I said, a lot of Peterson fans don't actually read what he wrote. You got to keep in mind, and actually just look at the people that were defending Peterson in that stream. I'm referring to it's linked on the blog. 4 people got together with a professor who's more of a Peterson skeptic. They got together to discuss Jordanetics. And it's kind of hilarious because if you don't believe that the 12 rules of life are aimed at the low status lobsters, just watch that video. We're not dealing with people who are high up on the dominance hierarchy. Are jammy wines popular in Italy? I have no idea what you're talking about, so I would say no. Let's see. Why have SJWs become so much worse in the last few years? I think because of social media. Are you familiar with Brandon Sanderson? Yes. Opinion on his writing? I think he's better than Robert Jordan, but I don't particularly enjoy his fantasy. With regards to your free trade is evil theory, which I like very much, is there a scenario wherein free movement of finances and good occurs without the free movement of people? Well, yes, back when Ricardo was first imagining it, because it was hard for people to move. But even then, the free trade logic was false. Peterson was bullied and downtrodden live on stage by Eric Dyson and did nothing to defend himself. It was pathetic. Maybe pathetic, but definitely predictable. Will Jordanetics be on Audible? Yes, eventually. We haven't recorded it yet. What is your take on the Big 5 traits? I'm not a big fan of that particular psychological construct. I could not read Map of Meanings. Thanks for doing that for me. It's very, very difficult to read. It's poorly written. Peterson's claim that he wrote each sentence 50 times is possibly the most auto-damning statement I've ever heard a writer make about himself. Do you find Jordan Peterson's rule number 1 to be similar to a controlling woman's desire to change a man to create a more attractive delta male? It's similar. It's not the same, but it's similar. I think what Peterson is trying to do is he's trying to keep people content to be soy boys. He wants them to be weak gamma boys. He doesn't want men to become men. The audience still went crazy for him in Vancouver. It was one of those most rambling speeches of his yet, one long run-on sentence, and he claimed it was his 108th show, yet still figuring it out. He will never figure it out because he has no intention whatsoever of actually saying anything directly. His whole game is preemptive mirroring. His whole game is to say nothing and allow you to think, to read your own thoughts into his words, and then accept your own thinking reinforced by his perceived authority. So you go away convinced that you're already on the right path, that you're doing the right thing, but now instead of it just being your laziness driving you, now you are doing nothing and remaining mediocre with the assurance that the wise philosopher has told you to do it. That's why when you talk to 5 different Peterson fans and ask them what he said, they'll tell you 5 different things, often all contradictory. How long before Peterson's collapse? I would be surprised if he, remained significant in any way within 18 months or so. Definitely, he'll be done, after the 2020 elections, in my opinion. Will you publish my fiction story? No. Have you read Terry Goodkin's Sword of Truth books? I read 2 of them. I thought they were awful. What do you think about Glenn Beck buying CRTV? I think that it's a combination of 2 failures that will fail even more dramatically. What blog is that link found on? That's voxday.blogspot.com. Are you going to help Owen Benjamin publish a book soon? I think that's a question that you should ask Owen. But I'm a big fan of his. Implication: JBP wants to reshape masculinity in his own image. I think he wants to cripple masculinity. I think he wants to destroy it. He's terrified of it. Like all gammas, he hates alphas. Were you the fastest white kid you know? I was, actually no, because I was a year behind the state champion, who was 0.4 of a second faster than me. Do you think Peterson has a goal of being some sort of secular prophet? Yes, without question. He wants to start the he wants to launch the first post-Christian religion. He's the replacement for the new atheists. The new atheists were an attack on Christianity, but it failed because they had nothing positive to offer. They had nothing but nihilism to offer. So they failed. So now Peterson has been built up because he at least offers something to fill the vacuum. You have to understand, Peterson is not a gateway to Christianity. Peterson is offering a substitute for Christianity. Maps of meaning. The politics of meaning. All of these things are designed to provide false substitutes for Christian morality, Christian purpose, Christian meaning. How will you distribute your movies, assuming the big cinemas won't touch them? I wouldn't assume that. Let's see. Will we see more false prophets when this SJW nonsense plays itself out? Certainly, without question. Should Gavin have distanced himself from the Proud Boys? No, of course not. Why on earth would you start an organization, convince people to follow you, and then abandon them? I think that was reprehensible. Let's see. Jordan Peterson equals C.S. Lewis's materialist magician. I've heard several people say that. I think that is a pretty good comparison. Opinion of antidepressants and those who take them. I think that it's a bad idea, but I don't know. I think they're probably prescribed much more than they should be. Shapiro versus Peterson in a boxing fight. Who would win? Nobody. Peterson wouldn't throw a punch, and Shapiro's would be ineffectual. Actually, okay, let me retract. Shapiro would win on points, because at least he would go like this, and tickle Peterson's chest. Peterson would not even raise his hands to defend himself. He might go sit in the corner and cry. Can Jordan B. Peterson become the next Prime Minister of Canada? I would be very surprised, because I think that there are a lot of skeletons in his closet. I watched the Peterson and Harris debate on religion. Oh, that was unbelievably bad. And Harris is a terrible debater. I mean, Peterson is so bad that he managed to lose to a guy who had previously lost every debate of his I'd ever watched or read. I would love for you to bring up JBP's political history. Oh, we will. It's in the book. Trust me. Not everything that I think about Jordan Peterson is in the book, but a lot of it is. And the stuff that is not in the book is the stuff that I could not substantiate and prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Why is Mike Cernovich so pro-Israel? I don't know. I mean, I'm pro-Israel. I think every nation deserves a homeland. I have friends there. Martin Van Creveld, one of the great living historians, is Israeli, and we have the privilege to publish his books. But I wouldn't regard myself as being any more pro-Israel than I am pro-England. Every nation needs a homeland. Let's see here. Question about Chicago typewriter. G, PG, or R? I would say PG-13. If you're looking for something to get a teenager, I would highly recommend the Wright Ho Jeeves Omnibus. Shapiro claims to be a black belt in Taekwondo or something. Oh, I had no idea. That would be hilarious. Some of you may not know, but I did 6 years of what was effectively MMA. We didn't call it that at the time. We actually called it shoot fighting. But this was right at the beginning of the whole octagon thing. In fact, one of my dojo mates, I think he was in the first, he was in one of the early, I think it was number 6 or something. Let's see. Shapiro's black belt is in running away. I first thought something was off about Peterson when he threatened to punch a reporter over Twitter. Typical Gamma. Well, no question. Like I said, Peterson couldn't even stand up to a 6-year-old boy. There's no way that he was ever going to actually punch a reporter. How long after the conquerors arrive, such as the Jews into Israel or Europeans into America, before you support them rather than the natives? Well, I think, I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule, but at a certain point you have to accept that what's done is done. Do you have any thoughts on keeping a daily schedule to be productive? I'm literally the worst person to ask. I seldom know what day it is. My thoughts are marry a woman who will keep track of that for you. JBP says in his book that he experiments with lucid dreaming. I considered it until someone told me a spirit guide shows up in your dreams and thought, oh, it's occultism masquerading as science. Yeah, what a lot of people don't realize is that Jordan Peterson actually practices magic. He utilizes, when he talks about his newfound pen of light, he's talking about automatic writing. That's something that occultists have practiced since the Theosophists. W.B. Yeats was a particular practitioner of it. So he is is definitely, he is definitely involved in the occult in some manner. A lot of people don't realize, but what he's talking about there is no different than using a Ouija board. Imagine what your reaction would be if instead of him talking about writing with his newfound pen of light, he talked about, writing with my newfound Ouija board. This is not spiritually healthy stuff. This is really, really bad stuff. This is not a gateway into Christianity. This is a gateway into Antichrist. Do you think Peterson has gone to the DMT realm? I have no idea what drugs he's taken. Deborah Kate is complaining about the women. Don't worry about it, Deborah. I've never been one of those who sees any reason to worry about who finds value in something. If they find value in it, great. If they don't, fine. Who's your favorite contemporary writer, commentator on Christianity? I'm always partial to Greg Boyd. I don't agree with everything he says, but I'm always partial to at least his thinking. Lucid dreaming isn't magic. You might want to do a little bit more reading up on that. How do you come up with ideas for video game? Don't ever ask somebody how they come up with ideas. We have no idea. It's just something you do. Do you think there's any hope of these globalists having their feet held to the fire without an actual physical war? In some countries. Definitely in some countries. But no, we're heading into a period of world war. There's no question about that. We've had a very long period of relative peace, one of the longest in history. And so we're overdue for wars across the West. And now that we have these massive movements of peoples, we know what the wars will be fought over. So it's not a surprise. Did you come up with your idea of free trade being evil after you moved to Italy? Well, about 20 years after it, yeah. I didn't come up with it until very, very recently. I thought that it was wrong, but I didn't make the connection to it actually being evil until like this month. It's not like I sit around and dwell on it, Do you have any career advice for a sad burger flipper? Don't be sad, and work on getting promoted to manager. And the better work you do at anything, however lowly, the better habits it will create. Are you a fan of R.A. Salvatore? No, I've never enjoyed his stuff. I've tried it several times, but I never quite understood why people liked it so much. Haven't the globalists done a good job keeping that long period of peace that you just mentioned? You could look at it that way, sure. But the problem is that the way that they have done so, the way that they have prevented war, whether you look at nuclear weapons or whether you look at the neoliberal world order, they have ensured that the wars that are to come are probably going to be worse than any before in human history. So I think more smaller wars over that are less violent would have been a lot better than what we appear to be headed for. Do you think certain states will group together to form new nations in the coming U.S. breakup? I would assume so. Opinion on William Lane Craig style apologetics. I don't like them. I have a lot of respect for him. I think that he's quite intelligent, but there is literally nothing about the way he goes about it that I would do. If you read The Irrational Atheist, and you see how I attack the arguments of the new atheists, you can probably understand why I'm not a big fan of Craig's approach. And to be fair, I'm sure that in the unlikely event William Lane Craig ever read any of my arguments, I have no doubt that he would not particularly be fond of them either. Do you have an opinion on the Tao Te Ching? I find it very interesting. I actually used it quite heavily in a novella I wrote called The Lesser Evil that's in the Altar of Hate, if you want to read it. Have you read Anna Karenina? Of course. Don't think trading the collapse of Western civilization is worth an abnormal period of peace. Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. Yes, Christopher Hallpike is the anthropologist referenced in Jordanetics. Great man, lovely man. I'm a huge fan of him. Have you been doing any movie comics research, seeing how you're entering the medium? I mean, more about that later or some other time. Let's see. Was Jesus talking about reincarnation when he said Isaiah has returned as John the Baptist? I don't believe so. After Peterson's stance on Kavanaugh, why have so few called bullshit? Because what Peterson does, whenever he does something stupid, something that exposes the con, he immediately goes into overdrive to quickly cover it up and give all of his fans an excuse to explain it away. He did the same thing with his disastrous appearance, or his disastrous debate with Harris. When he exposed himself there, then he went on Joe Rogan and blamed it all on drinking cider and being sleepless. The Kavanaugh thing, I mean, he's a gamma. He will always have some redefinition, some justification to get him off the hook for his failures. What's your opinion on hiring prostitutes? Well, the Bible is pretty clear on that being the way to death. So I think it's probably a bad idea. It's understandable why people are tempted, but I think it's a temptation that should be resisted. I have no idea who Mike Ruppert is, so no. Can you give us a reading list outside the Vox books? Yeah, I mean, go to Castelia Books Direct. I've got several. I've got lists of best science fiction, best fantasy, best history, all there. You can even buy the books there. Any thoughts on Catalan's attempt to pull away from Spain? We were actually there at the peak of it. It's much more complicated than I could possibly do it justice at the moment. Did the Founding Fathers mention the significance of common culture and heritage anywhere else other than Federalist Paper 2? I believe so, yes. I couldn't tell you where off the top of my head. Aren't we overdue for a pandemic as well? Quite possibly. Is there anyone in the intellectual dark web worth listening to? No. Let's see. If the shit hits the fan, should I be concerned about the thousands of Latino men that have invaded my area in rural Virginia? Yes, because they, being the great grandson of a Mexican revolutionary, I can tell you that the one thing that the bronze race is very good at is clearing everybody else out of the territory they want. Just look at the changing demographics of Compton. It's absolutely amazing. How did you arrive at the conclusion that the Bible is the truest word of God? Because the model of reality that it provides is the most consistent with my observations over 50 years of life on the planet. This is my grandfather's chair. Were the Puritans on the right track at all? Mostly no. Shouldn't you listen to your enemies? I listen very closely to my enemies. I read their books in most cases, I know their books better than most of the followers do. What's your favorite book that you have written? Probably A Throne of Bones. Ridgeback versus Dogo Argentino. Definitely Ridgeback. Have you ever been on Joe Rogan podcast? No, nor will I. Just so you understand, I don't really do media. The only people that I talk to are people who either are basically people who work with Castalia House and Arkhaven. Is meditation a gateway to Satanism? I think it's more of a gateway to demonic influence. There's obviously, I studied in Japan. There's obviously a lot of paganism that is not overt Satanism. Do you accept the biblical earth is flat and stationary? No. How long did it take to write Throne of Bones? About 400 days. Were you always religious? No, I wasn't. I was raised in a Christian home, but I didn't become religious until I was 27. Do you travel outside of Europe much? I wouldn't say much. Most comparable fantasy novels to Throne of Bones? Definitely A Game of Thrones. Do you always speak this calmly? Pretty much. I'm the kindler, gentler Dark Lord. Honestly, I've just never really seen much point in a lot of screaming and theatrics. Will Trump build the wall? I hope so. Are eyeglasses a form of birth control? Sometimes it seems that way, doesn't it? I would love to see you go on the Red Elephants. Yeah, I don't do that anymore. I've probably turned down at this point 35 interviews related to Jordanetics. Frankly, it's a waste of time for me. And it usually causes far more trouble than it's worth. Far more trouble. Is it easy to find an Italian citizen who owns a firearm? Yes. How's the dog doing? Yeah, we have one of our dogs picked up a pretty bad infection, and unfortunately, they found out what it is, and they're getting the proper medicine for it. So we're hoping that the dog is still strong enough to cope with the medicine. So he's not out of the woods yet, but we are hopeful. And he's honestly the nicest dog I've ever known. And so if you're inclined to pray for dogs, please don't hesitate to pray for Mazie. If you've read Jordanetics, then you understand how important dogs are to me and to our family in general. Let's see. Vox Day is delusional. I'm really not. Would you ever clone your dog? I have to admit, I probably would. You like dogs, Jordan like cats. Are cats evil? All I'll say is that I've always had a particular affection for Tanith Lee's short story on how cats were created. Do you play any musical instruments? I play some keyboards, play a little bass. Not very good at either. All right, well, hey, that's all I've got time for tonight. So thanks for tuning in. That was, remember, the first rule, the first real rule of Jordanetics is be mediocre. And that is no rule for life. Strive for excellence. Envision perfection. Strive for excellence. Hope for success. Have a good evening. I'm Vox Day, and this is the Darkstream.